The last time I heard my son's voice was 3 years ago, a brief phone call where he said he needed space, and I said okay because I didn't know what else to say. My daughter stopped answering my texts 6 months before that, her silence arriving gradually, responses growing shorter and less frequent until they disappeared entirely. I used to check my phone constantly, refreshing my messages, like somehow that would make their names appear, words of explanation or reconciliation materializing if I just waited long enough. People ask what happened, what I did to make them leave, and the truth is, I don't fully know. There were misunderstandings, old resentments, things I said or didn't say, ways I failed them. That seemed small at the time, but accumulated into something they couldn't forgive. I spent the first year waiting for them to come back, apologizing to empty air, rehearsing conversations I'd never get to have. Then I spent the second year angry, hurt that they could discard me so completely after everything I'd sacrificed. Now, in the third year, I'm learning something unexpected, that healing doesn't require their forgiveness, that I can build a life worth living even without the people I built my entire world around. My name is Catherine. Though my children used to call me mom with varying degrees of warmth depending on their age and mood. I'm 62 years old, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment that still has their childhood artwork in boxes I can't quite bring myself to unpack or throw away. The apartment is on the 3rd floor of an older building, rent-controlled, with a small balcony, where I've started growing herbs in mismatched pots. The space is quiet in a way my life never used to be. When they were young, when the house was full of noise and needs and the constant motion of raising 2 children, mostly on my own, I work as a pediatric nurse at the county hospital, a job I've held for 34 years. I chose pediatrics because I love children, wanted to help them, and maybe because some part of me has always been trying to prove I'm good with kids, despite the evidence my own children might present to the contrary. My shifts are long, 10 to 12 hours usually, and I prefer working the harder cases. The babies born too early or the toddlers fighting illnesses their small bodies barely understand. There's something about caring for other people's children that feels both painful and necessary. A way of channeling maternal instinct that has nowhere else to go. My mornings start at 5 when I wake without an alarm. My body trained to hospital schedules after so many years. I make tea in the same chipped mug I've been using for a decade, sit on the balcony if weather permits, watch the city wake up below me. There's a man who walks his dog past the building at 5:30 every morning, like clockwork, and we've developed a routine of waving to each other without ever exchanging names. These small rituals have become my anchors, predictable touchstones in a life that feels unmoored in bigger ways. I have a routine of checking my phone that I'm trying to break but haven't managed yet. First thing when I wake, during my lunch break, before bed, opening messages to see if either of them has reached out, knowing they won't but unable to stop hoping. Their profiles on social media are blocked or deleted. No way for me to see how they're living, whether they're happy, if they ever think of me. That absence of information is its own kind of grief. Not knowing whether they're struggling or thriving, sick or healthy, whether they've moved or changed jobs or maybe even started families, I'll never meet. I've become the kind of person who talks to strangers more than I used to, striking up conversations in grocery store lines or at the coffee shop near the hospital. Not deep conversations, just surface exchanges that remind me I still exist in the world, that I can still make people smile or laugh with small observations about weather or traffic. The barista at the coffee shop knows my order now, makes my latte before I reach the counter, and that tiny recognition feels like something to hold on to. My apartment is neat, but not obsessively so, lived in, but not quite homey. I have photographs displayed, but they're mostly from when the kids were young, before whatever broke between us started breaking. There's one of my daughter at 8, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera with her whole face. One of my son at 12, awkward in the way of pre-teens, arm thrown around his sister in a moment of rare sibling affection. I can look at these pictures now without crying, which feels like progress, though I still avoid the later photos. The teenage years when their eyes started looking at me differently. The silence from them is not new anymore, but it's still disorienting, like learning to walk after losing a limb. I find myself starting to call them about small things, a funny thing that happened at work, a question about a recipe, a memory that surfaced unexpectedly, before remembering I can't, that they've chosen to exist in a world that doesn't include me. That remembering happens dozens of times a day. A constant, low-level loss that I'm learning to carry without letting it flatten me completely. Comment below if you've experienced estrangement from family and how you've coped with that loss. Don't forget to subscribe. This story is about finding yourself when the people who defined you are gone. I became a mother at 26, younger than I'd planned, but not so young it seemed impossible. My son arrived first, a difficult pregnancy and harder delivery that left me exhausted and overwhelmed, but fiercely protective. His father and I had been married 2 years, one of those relationships that looked stable from outside but felt hollow from within. We'd married because it seemed like the logical next step, because our families approved, because I wanted children, and he seemed willing to provide them. My daughter came 3 years later. An easier pregnancy, but born into a marriage that was already crumbling. By the time she was 2, her father had moved out, citing irreconcilable differences that really just meant he'd met someone else and wanted permission to pursue it. The divorce was quick and relatively painless, his involvement with the children minimal from the start, child support payments that arrived irregularly and stopped entirely within 5 years. I became a single mother not by choice, but by circumstance. Shouldering responsibilities I'd imagined sharing, those early years of single parenthood were brutally hard in ways I've tried to forget, but can't completely. Working full-time as a nurse meant irregular hours, night shifts, weekends, constantly scrambling for childcare. My mother helped when she could, but she was still working herself, had her own life, her own limitations. I left my kids with babysitters whose names I barely knew, dropped them at daycare when they cried and clung to my legs, picked them up, exhausted and guilty and trying to squeeze a full day's worth of parenting into the few hours before bedtime. Money was perpetually tight. We lived in a small apartment, not terrible, but not the house, with a yard I'd imagined giving them. I bought clothes from thrift stores, said no to toys and activities other kids had, stretched ground beef and pasta into 7 different meals. My son asked once why we couldn't go to Disneyland like his friend's family, and I snapped at him, said, "Some people have to work for a living," immediately regretted the harshness, but couldn't take it back. These small moments of failing them accumulated like stones in my chest. I tried my best, which is what every parent says and what never feels like enough. I helped with homework, attended school events when my shift allowed, coached my daughter's soccer team one season, even though I knew nothing about soccer. I made birthday cakes from scratch, read bedtime stories until my voice went hoarse, taught them to ride bikes in the apartment complex parking lot. But I was also tired constantly, stretched too thin, quick to anger when they pushed boundaries or made messes or just needed more than I had to give. Adolescence brought different challenges. My son became moody and withdrawn, spending hours in his room with the door locked, pushing back against every rule I tried to enforce. We fought about everything: curfews, grades, friends I didn't approve of, the attitude he wore like armor. I didn't know how to reach him, didn't understand that his anger might be masking hurt. I responded with stricter rules, more punishments, thinking discipline was what he needed, when maybe he just needed me to listen without trying to fix everything. My daughter was easier in some ways, harder in others. She excelled in school, made me proud with straight A's and scholarship offers, but she kept herself distant emotionally, never quite letting me past her careful surface. We'd have pleasant conversations that revealed nothing real, and when I pushed for deeper connection, she'd shut down, say I was being too intense, too needy. I didn't realize I was losing her until she'd already built walls I couldn't scale. The breaking point came gradually, not one dramatic event, but an accumulation of small fractures. My son dropped out of college his 2nd year, said he needed to find himself, moved across the country with a girlfriend I'd met once. I told him he was making a mistake, that he was throwing away his future, said it harshly because I was scared for him. He stopped calling regularly after that, our conversations becoming brief and obligatory, his voice distant even when his words were polite. My daughter graduated, got a good job, moved to a different state for work. She visited for holidays initially, brief trips where she seemed eager to leave, checking her phone constantly, making excuses about work. I tried too hard during those visits, planned too many activities, asked too many questions, couldn't quite hide my desperation for her attention. After one Christmas, where I cried because she was leaving early, she stopped coming at all, said it was too stressful, that I made everything about my feelings instead of just letting her visit without pressure. I didn't handle their pulling away well. I called too often, texted too frequently, showed up at my son's apartment once unannounced because he hadn't returned my calls in weeks. He was civil, but cold, said I needed to respect his boundaries, that he'd call when he was ready. I tried to explain. I was just worried, just wanted to know he was okay. But he said that was the problem, that I'd never trusted them to manage their own lives. The words stung because they held truth I didn't want to acknowledge. The final break came after I made what I thought was a reasonable request. My daughter had mentioned in a rare text exchange that she'd been seeing a therapist, working through some things. I asked what things, said maybe I could help, that we could talk about whatever was bothering her. She sent back a long message, longer than she'd written in months, explaining that I was what she was working through, my criticism, my emotional neediness, the way I'd made them responsible for my happiness their whole lives. I read that message sitting in my car outside the hospital after a 12-hour shift, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. She listed specific instances I barely remembered, times I'd guilted them for wanting to spend holidays with friends instead of me, comments about their choices that felt like judgments, the way I'd treated their independence as rejection rather than growth. She said she needed space to figure out who she was, separate from my expectations, and that every time we talked, I pulled her back into patterns that hurt her. I responded badly. I wrote back, defending myself, explaining all the sacrifices I'd made for them, how I'd given up everything to raise them alone, how unfair it was for her to blame me for doing my best under impossible circumstances. I said she was being ungrateful, that she had no idea how hard single motherhood was, that one day when she had kids of her own, she'd understand. I hit send before thinking, watch the message show as delivered, then read, then nothing. She never responded. My son, when I called him crying about the fight with his sister, said he agreed with her, said they'd talked about it, compared notes, realized they'd both been trying to manage my emotions their whole lives. He said it gently, with obvious discomfort, but the words landed like physical blows. He said he loved me, but couldn't be in relationship with me right now, that it wasn't healthy for him, that maybe someday, after I did some work on myself, they could try again. Then he said he had to go, and the line went dead. I spent the next week calling and texting both of them, messages that started apologetic and grew increasingly desperate. I said I was sorry, that I didn't mean it, that we could work it out if they'd just talk to me. I sent long texts explaining my perspective, my pain, my confusion about how loving them so completely had somehow been the thing that drove them away. They didn't respond. After 2 weeks, I noticed my texts to my daughter were showing as green instead of blue. She'd blocked my number. My son's messages still showed as delivered but unread, which somehow felt worse. I became obsessed with understanding what I'd done wrong. I joined online forums for estranged parents, read threads full of people whose children had cut them off, looking for answers. But the forums were full of parents insisting they'd done nothing wrong, that their children were selfish or mentally ill or influenced by bad partners. The few parents who took responsibility, who examined their own behavior honestly, were often attacked by other members for being too self-blaming. I left the forums feeling more confused than before. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought I needed it, but because my son had suggested it, and I was willing to try anything that might bring them back. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, was in her 50s, warm but direct, and she didn't let me hide behind victimhood. She asked questions that made me uncomfortable, pointed out patterns I didn't want to see, gently suggested that maybe my children's perspective held validity, even if their delivery was harsh. I resisted at first, spent sessions defending myself, but slowly her questions started seeping in. My work suffered. I'd arrive at the hospital distracted, fighting back tears during rounds, struggling to focus on my young patients when my own children felt like open wounds. A colleague found me crying in the supply closet one afternoon and asked if I was okay. I told her everything, the whole pathetic story, and she listened without judgment. She said her own mother had been estranged from her for years, that sometimes relationships can't be forced, that the kindest thing is to let people go, even when it breaks you. I didn't want to believe her, but I heard the truth in it. The holidays that first year after they cut contact were excruciating. I worked Christmas and New Year's, volunteering for the shifts no one wanted, grateful for any distraction from the silence of my apartment. I bought gifts for them anyway, wrapped them carefully, stored them in the closet with tags that said "for when we talk again." Looking at those gifts now, Still wrapped after 3 years, feels like looking at artifacts from a different life. Evidence of hope. I can't quite sustain anymore, but also can't quite release. I gained weight that first year. Stopped exercising, ate comfort food that didn't comfort. Moved through my days like a ghost haunting my own life. Friends tried to help, invited me to dinners and movies, but I was terrible company, unable to talk about anything except my children's absence. Eventually the invitations slowed, and I understood. People have limited capacity for someone else's ongoing grief, especially grief without resolution or end date. 18 months into the estrangement, Dr. Martinez asked me a question that changed something fundamental. She said, "What would healing look like if your children never spoke to you again?" I started to protest that healing without them wasn't possible, that they were my children, that a mother doesn't stop being a mother just because her kids stop calling. She waited, patient, until I ran out of objections, then asked again. I didn't have an answer, which was itself an answer. I started doing the work she suggested, uncomfortable work of examining my parenting honestly. I wrote down memories from their childhood, not the sanitized versions I'd told myself, but the real ones, including moments I wasn't proud of. The time I screamed at my son for spilling juice, my rage disproportionate to the offense. The way I'd talked to my daughter about her weight during high school, concern I'd framed as care but delivered as criticism. The countless times I'd made my exhaustion and stress their problem, confiding in them about adult worries, leaning on them for emotional support they were too young to provide. Writing these memories was painful, forcing me to see myself as my children might have seen me, not the martyred single mother working herself to the bone, but a woman who loved them fiercely but imperfectly, whose own unhealed wounds had sometimes bled onto them. I saw how my need for their gratitude had placed a burden they couldn't carry, how my fear of losing them had manifested as control that pushed them away, how my identity as their mother had left no room for them to establish identities separate from my needs. I started attending a different support group, one specifically for estranged parents willing to examine their own contributions to the estrangement. The group was smaller, harder to find, full of parents doing painful work instead of seeking validation. We shared stories not to assign blame, but to understand patterns, to see how unexamined pain passes through generations, how good intentions don't prevent harm. I listened to a woman talk about how her anxiety had manifested as constant criticism, making her daughter feel like nothing she did was good enough. I recognized myself in her story, felt something loosen in my chest. I wrote letters to my children that I never sent, following Dr. Martinez's suggestion. Letters where I took full responsibility without defending myself, where I acknowledged specific harms without minimizing them, where I said I understood why they needed distance and respected that choice even though it hurt. Writing these letters helped me understand that apologizing isn't about expecting forgiveness or resolution, it's about acknowledging truth regardless of outcome. I kept the letters in a folder, not as drafts I planned to send, but as evidence of work I was doing for myself. I started building a life that didn't revolve around waiting for them to return. I joined a book club at the library, forcing myself to show up even when I didn't feel like it, gradually becoming someone who participated rather than observed. I started hiking on my days off, following trails in the nearby mountains, finding something meditative in the physical exertion and force focus on immediate terrain. I adopted a cat from the shelter, a scraggly senior cat no one else wanted, and named her Pearl. Taking care of her gave me something to nurture without the complicated weight of parental expectation. I reduced my hours at the hospital slightly, using the extra time not to obsess about my children, but to develop other interests. I took a ceramics class at the community center, my first creative pursuit in decades, finding unexpected joy in shaping clay with my hands. My pieces were clumsy and uneven, but they were mine, created for no purpose except the pleasure of creation. I started a small vegetable garden on my balcony, growing tomatoes and peppers in containers, tending them with care that asked nothing in return. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I'd been using my children to avoid examining my own life, my own identity beyond motherhood. She asked what I liked, what brought me joy, what I wanted my life to look like, and I struggled to answer. I'd spent so many years defining myself only in relation to them that I'd lost track of who I was separately. Learning to answer those questions became its own kind of healing. Rediscovering interests and dreams I'd abandoned when I became a mother, I reconnected with my younger sister. Someone I'd let drift during the years I was consumed by single parenthood. We started having weekly phone calls, and slowly I learned to talk about things other than my estrangement, to ask about her life, to be present for her struggles instead of always centering my own pain. She mentioned once that I seemed different, lighter somehow, and I realized it was true. The constant weight of waiting had started to lift, replaced by something I couldn't quite name, but that felt like the early stages of acceptance. 2.5 years into the estrangement, I was hiking a trail I'd done dozens of times when I stopped at an overlook to rest. The view stretched for miles, layers of mountains fading into distance, and I stood there feeling something shift inside me. Not dramatic, not a revelation, just a quiet recognition that I was okay. Not happy exactly, not healed completely, but okay in a way that felt sustainable. I could live with this, could build a life that had meaning and purpose even without them in it. I realized I'd stopped checking my phone compulsively, stopped holding my breath every time I heard a notification. The hope for their return hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something gentler, less desperate. I still wanted them in my life, but I no longer needed them there to feel whole. That distinction felt monumental, like finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body-to work. I started mentoring younger nurses, sharing knowledge I'd accumulated over decades in pediatrics. I found satisfaction in teaching, in watching newer nurses develop confidence, in feeling useful without requiring gratitude or recognition. One of the nurses I mentored told me I'd changed the way she thought about patient care, made her more compassionate, and I felt pride. That had nothing to do with my children or my failure with them. I was building an identity that stood on its own merits. I wrote one final letter to my children, different from the others. This one wasn't an apology or an explanation or a plea for reconciliation. It was simply an acknowledgement that I understood they needed distance, that I respected their choice, that I was working on myself not to win them back but because it was necessary work regardless of outcome. I said I loved them, would always love them, but that I was releasing them from any obligation to fix or manage my feelings about their absence. I mailed it with no expectation of response, and felt relief rather than anxiety after dropping it in the mailbox. My daughter's response came 6 weeks later, not a phone call or reconciliation, but a brief email. She said she'd received my letter, appreciated the tone, wasn't ready for regular contact, but wanted me to know she was doing well. She said maybe someday they could try again, but not yet, and she hoped I'd respect that. The email was kind but boundaried, and instead of feeling devastated by its limitations, I felt something like gratitude. She'd responded. She was well. That was enough. I wrote back briefly, thanking her for reaching out, telling her I understood and respected her timeline. I shared a few small updates about my life, the ceramics class, the garden, Pearl the cat, nothing heavy, nothing that demanded response. I ended by saying I'd be here when and if she was ever ready, but that I was okay either way. I meant it. She didn't write back, but the small connection, brief as it was, felt like a gift I hadn't earned, but would accept with grace. My son never responded to the letter, and I made peace with that too. I understood that his healing might require permanent distance, that I might never have relationship with him again. And while that truth hurt, it didn't destroy me the way it would have earlier. I sent him birthday cards with brief messages, not expecting responses, just marking the day quietly from my own life. Whether he received them or threw them away unread, I didn't know, and tried not to wonder. 3 years into the estrangement, my life has taken shape in ways I never expected. I wake most mornings without the immediate stab of loss, move through my days with purpose. That isn't about waiting for something to change. I still think of my children daily, still love them with a fierce maternal ache that hasn't diminished. But the love has learned to exist alongside acceptance rather than desperate hope. I've become closer with colleagues at the hospital, accepting invitations to dinners and parties, showing up as someone who can laugh and contribute to conversation beyond personal tragedy. I've built real friendships with people from my book club and hiking group, relationships based on current connection rather than shared history. These friendships don't replace what I've lost with my children, but they fill spaces I didn't realize were empty. My ceramics have improved enough that I've started selling a few pieces at a local craft market. The money isn't significant, but the validation of strangers choosing my work, finding beauty or utility in things I've made, feeds something in me that needed feeding. I've started taking commissions, making custom pieces for people's homes, finding satisfaction in creating functional beauty that will be used and appreciated. Pearl, my scraggly rescue cat, has become a genuine companion. She sleeps on my bed at night, purrs in my lap while I read, greets me when I come home from work with the kind of uncomplicated affection I'd forgotten existed. Caring for her has taught me about giving without keeping score, about love that doesn't demand reciprocity. She doesn't know about my estranged children, doesn't care about my failures as a mother, just accepts the care I offer and returns it in her own cat way. I've maintained my therapy with Dr. Martinez, though less frequently now. Our sessions have shifted from crisis management to ongoing growth, examining patterns not just in my parenting but in all my relationships. She's helped me understand that my need to be needed had shaped how I loved, making my affection feel like a weight rather than a gift. Learning to love without needing to be necessary has been some of the hardest work I've done. My sister and I have grown closer than we've been since childhood. She's become someone I trust with my actual feelings, not performed strength or defensive justifications. And she offers honesty without judgment. When I'm struggling, she reminds me of my progress. When I'm doing well, she celebrates without needing to mention what I've lost. She's proof that family can heal even when other parts stay broken. I've reduced my hours at the hospital to 3 days a week, giving myself more time for pursuits that feed my soul rather than just my survival. The financial adjustment required careful budgeting, but the emotional payoff has been worth it. I have time now to hike, to work with clay, to read books that have nothing to do with parenting or estrangement, to simply exist without always producing or proving. I'm 62 years old, 3 years estranged from my children, and I've learned that healing doesn't look like I thought it would. I thought healing required their forgiveness, their return, some kind of resolution where we all acknowledged our parts and moved forward together. But healing has turned out to be something I do alone. A decision to build a life worth living, even when the people I most want in it have chosen absence. The hardest truth I've learned is that loving someone perfectly isn't possible. That every parent harms their children in ways both intentional and accidental. And that taking responsibility doesn't guarantee reconciliation. I was not the mother I wanted to be. I let my fear and exhaustion and unhealed wounds affect how I raised them. I used them to meet emotional needs they were too young to carry. These truths don't make me a monster, but they don't make me innocent either. I exist in the complicated middle space of having tried my best while acknowledging my best cause harm. I don't know if my children will ever speak to me again. My daughter's brief email gave me hope, but also taught me that hope needs boundaries, that I can't let possible future reconciliation prevent me from living my actual present. My son's silence might be permanent, and I've had to grieve him the way you grieve someone who's died, except he's alive somewhere, living a life I'm not part of. That specific grief has no roadmap, no socially acceptable timeline, no point where people stop asking if I've heard from him yet. What I've learned is that identity doesn't have to be tied to a single role. I'm still their mother, will always be their mother, but I'm also a nurse, a friend, a ceramicist, a hiker, a woman learning to inhabit her own life fully. These other identities don't erase my motherhood, but they provide foundation when motherhood feels like quicksand. I can fail at being their mother and still succeed at being myself. The support group for estranged parents continues to meet monthly, and I've become someone who offers hope to newer members. Not false hope of guaranteed reconciliation, but real hope that life can be meaningful even with this specific loss. I watch new members arrive devastated, certain they can't survive without their children's presence. And I want to tell them that they can, that they will. That survival sometimes looks different than we imagined, but is possible nonetheless. I keep the wrapped Christmas presents in my closet still. 3 years of gifts for children who may never receive them. Sometimes I think I should donate them, that keeping them is holding on to false hope. But other times I think keeping them is simply honoring love that exists even without reciprocation. Maybe next year I'll donate them. Maybe I'll keep them forever. Either choice feels acceptable now in a way it wouldn't have earlier. My apartment feels like home now, rather than a waiting room. I've hung art on the walls, invested in comfortable furniture, made choices about my space that reflect who I am now rather than who I was when they were in my life. The second bedroom, which I'd kept as a guest room in case they visited, has become my studio, shelves of ceramics and works in progress. A space entirely mine that doesn't apologize for existing. If I could talk to my younger self, The single mother drowning in exhaustion and responsibility. I'd tell her to be gentler with herself, to ask for help instead of wearing martyrdom like armor, to understand that children need a whole mother, not a sacrificial one. I'd tell her that loving them means letting them become separate people, even when that separation feels like rejection. I'd tell her that she's doing better than she thinks and worse than she hopes, and that both things can be true simultaneously. I pour my tea now on my balcony, surrounded by plants I've tended, looking out over a city full of people living their own complicated lives. And I feel something I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or happy endings, but the peace of acceptance, of having done the work to understand myself, of building a life that has meaning even with this permanent ache. My children may never forgive me, may never want relationship with me again. And I've learned that I can survive that, can even thrive despite it. The truth is that healing without their apologies has made me stronger than healing with them might have. I've had to look honestly at my failures, develop identity beyond motherhood, learn to find joy in small things that don't require their validation. They gave me the gift of absence, painful as it was, forcing me to become someone who doesn't need them to complete me. I will always love them. I will always hope for reconciliation. But I no longer need those things to feel whole. And that unexpected freedom feels like its own kind of grace.